Hi, my name is Marjorie Winters. I'm the president of the Simsbury Land Trust. I want to welcome you all here tonight. Came through the rain, which is always a good sign. And we're in for a treat tonight. We have Susan Messina here to speak to us on brain health. Let me read a little bit of Susan's bio here. Susan Messina, PhD, is the Vernon D. Rosa Professor of Applied Science at Trinity College. Her neuroscience research focuses on brain metabolism, brain health, and disorders such as epilepsy, autism, and pain. Recently, she has been applying an interdisciplinary lens to local resource use and land conservation. During the 1918-1919, Dr. Messina was the Charles Bullard Fellow in Forest Research at Harvard University and is translating that work directly into her scholarship and teaching. In 2019, she collaborated with a climate scientist and an ecologist to publish the seminal paper on proforestation. You'll be speaking about that tonight. And the quantified benefits of natural stewardship of a strategic subset of existing forest ecosystems. Recently, Dr. Messina served as the co-chair of the Science and Technology Working Group of the Governor's Council on Climate Change in Connecticut, and is currently on the Open Space Commission in Simsbury, where I have the pleasure of serving with her. So I want to welcome Susan tonight, and I will turn over this live mic to you.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Marjorie. And I'd like to give a very special welcome to the inaugural holder of the Vernon D. Rosa Chair at Trinity College, Dr. Joe Bronzino, and it's a real treat to have him here tonight. So Joe passed his endowed chair on to me, so thank you. So tonight I'm going to be talking to you about nature and brain health, back to the future. And it's kind of interesting. Both of my kind of scientific areas that I work in now are characterized by a couple of things. Number one, they're characterized by being historic ideas that are now coming to the fore again. And they're also characterized by my deep interest in complex, resilient, evolved systems. And probably two of the most complex and resilient and evolved systems we can think about are forest ecosystems and the human brain. So I have a deep appreciation for the complexity of these systems, and it's been my life's work to try and understand, I would say, maybe the mystery and the math behind it. So my take-home message, I always like to start with the take-home message, is that we need nature. This is not optional. It's essential. It's essential as our lifeline. It's essential to protect our clean water. It's essential to protect our ecological integrity and species that we need. It's essential to protect the library of evolution, the things we haven't studied yet. It's essential to provide corridors for climate migration as species need to adapt and as our climate is changing. So this is an absolutely essential part of our landscape. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about this essential part of our landscape from the perspective of history, science, and the future. So I'm going to actually start with a neuron that's in the human brain. This is a neuron in the cerebral cortex. It's a pyramidal cell called such because it has this kind of triangular shape. And this drawing was done by a scientist called Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He was born in 1852, and he discovered so much about brains just by drawing them and looking in microscopes. He developed so many theories that we now have proven with fancy scientific techniques. He proposed that neurons are individual units in the nervous system. He proposed that they have connections between them and that neurons are organized into circuits that underlie specific behaviors. He talked about the specific functions of neurons which related to their specific shapes. And he also talked about the plasticity of the nervous system. So many things that are kind of bedrock new findings in the nervous system during my lifetime were really kind of foreshadowed by the work of Santiago Ramon y Cajal. So to just look at this a little bit more closely, what you can see is on these little processes from that neuron, there's all these little spiky bits. So those spiky bits are dendritic spines on the dendrites of that neuron. And those spiky bits are where another neuron is talking to that neuron. So what you can see if I go back to this neuron, there's literally thousands of inputs onto this one neuron from other neurons. And it can send connections to many, many other neurons. It's an incredibly complex system. And this is just the anatomy, not even the neurochemistry and everything else. The other thing that Cahal saw is that every neuron had one process that didn't have any spiky bits. So that's the one, the A on the right, and that's the axon. So all the spiky covered parts are all receiving information. It's integrated and collected in that one little triangular part, the cell body, and it's sent out by one process, the axon. And so he really made some incredibly fundamental observations, and we're now capitalizing on that with a lot of new insights. Just to talk a little bit about history with respect to brain health and nature, we know that Native American, indigenous people around the world had a very deep respect for nature, and often had sacred groves and places that they considered special or holy. Another giant in science is Charles Darwin, who gave us the theory of evolution, that it is through this through natural selection that we now have all the complexity of life and adaptation to different conditions. And Charles Darwin was born, I think, in 1809, I'm trying to remember. So Cahal was 1852, Darwin was 1809, so had his 200th birthday a little while ago. We're all familiar with Henry David Thoreau, and I wanted to particularly highlight Frederick Law Olmsted tonight, because Olmsted is coming up on his 200th birthday next year in 2022. And he was really pivotal in a lot of our landscapes that we have now, and had a very deep appreciation both for gardens and parks and also for natural landscapes. He's considered the founder of the field of landscape architecture. He was also an author and a conservationist, and he brought his experience as a farmer, as a journalist, as kind of an interdisciplinary perspective to his work in landscape architecture. And he deeply appreciated the beneficial and invigorating and restorative effects of nature on health. And he and his son were both involved in the founding of the national parks, the kind of fundamental statement associated with it, to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife, and leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So there was a real commitment to caring for what we have and making sure that future generations could enjoy the health benefits, the aesthetic beauty, quiet that nature afforded. So just a little interim summary on some historical perspectives of nature and health. As I mentioned, there were often spiritual groves or sacred spaces. In the 1800s, what became very popular is something called the nature cure for people that were having challenges with mental illness. So this nature cure brought gardens into hospitals and advised people to go camping, spend time in parks to help them with the troubles that they were having. And at that time, it might be called melancholy or mania, or just neurasthenia, so a kind of a brain wearing out of the brain that was thought to particularly happen to people who had white-collar jobs that involved a lot of brain activity. And I like this slogan at the end. It's Swedish, dra åt skogen. I don't know if anyone's Swedish here. Actually, I know some people know Swedish people well. But dra åt skogen means go to the forest. And it's something you would say if you're Swedish and someone's really bugging you and you don't want to deal with them anymore. So it's kind of a nicer thing than get lost. And the implication is go to the forest, and then things will be better when you get back. Emerson and Muir also talked about healing powers for both the mind and the body. And Olmsted's, one of his main missions was urban preventative health. So that was one of his main goals with parks and these landscapes in areas. And this is at a time when the main concern was sanitation. He said it's not just sanitation, it's clean air for people. It's places for people to get together and have a common space that offered equity. Now they offer, education, can also offer opportunities to look at ecology. And when he designed Central Park, he sent notices to doctors to encourage them to have young mothers come and spend time in the park, because he knew that young mothers had a lot of demands on their time and they needed some restoration. So my particular, work right now is focused on helping people to understand that forests are essential. They're essential for our minds. They're essential for new medicines. Many, many of our medicines that we have now were developed from forest species, and there's so many that we haven't discovered yet. And they're critical in addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the Global Safety Net, all of these worldwide international science-based consensus reports make it clear that we cannot solve our global crises in climate and biodiversity without protecting our forests and without allowing nature to help us. So we really need a strategic plan to protect our lifelines to the best future. So when I was the co-chair of the Science and Technology Working Group with the Governor's Council on Climate Change, we really focused on multisolving. So multisolving is an approach that was developed by Climate Interactive at MIT. It basically is saying that there's situations that will help the climate long term, but also can help us now. And whereas it's been difficult to get a lot of action on climate because it seems too far off or too difficult for people to understand, let's think about things that help us now that also help the climate, and maybe we can get some traction on those. So this flower diagram illustrates the many different values and benefits that multisolving could produce. So with the Governor's Council on Climate Change, climate protection, of course, is always a core goal. We put in the additional goal of diverse perspectives and equity, and we also added ecological integrity, because since this was developed, there's been a lot of additional information that's, in my opinion, even more concerning than carbon in the atmosphere, is the loss of ecological integrity, spread of invasive species, and potential collapse of a lot of ecosystems. Some of the co-benefits of helping these core things that we need are health, well-being, and safety, jobs, resilience, connections to each other. So tonight I'm going to focus specifically on health, well-being, and safety, but we're keeping all of the core values in mind at the same time. The other key about multisolving is we have to bring unbiased and interdisciplinary science to the table. There are often stakeholders involved in processes, and stakeholders often have a conflict of interest. One goal of multisolving is reducing that conflict so you can at least get to the truth and then figure out how you're going to navigate things to make them better. We focused on impacts and essentials, so clean water was considered an essential, for example. We focused on the real need for more data and research. This is critical. There's a lot that we don't know. We focused on locally scaled opportunities and actions. So if we're in charge of the Governor's Council on Climate Change in Connecticut, we need to focus on what's going to help communities in Connecticut. And I was personally very committed to making this report positive. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty related to, our global crises. And if we can think of ways that suggest positive things for communities to do that will help them long term, that's what we need to focus on. So my other take-home message that I wanted to give you tonight is we need three things on our landscape. We need nature. We need natural areas that are allowed to evolve intact with the least intervention possible. So we need nature that has evidence-based intervention, like medicine. We don't operate on healthy people. We need a lot more research. We have only been in here for a very short amount of time, and what's happened in this amount of time is fairly terrifying. And there's so much we don't know. So we need to also adopt the medical approach of first do no harm. We also need resources. So we absolutely need resources. So we need to decide how we're going to strategically manage our landscape so that we have the resources that we need. We're responsible with those resources. We have local systems for those resources that will prevent disruption and provide the least waste and the most efficient use of those resources. We need more research, and we absolutely need to prioritize nature. And just to let you know, the thing that we have prioritized the least, and that gives me grave concern, is the lack of priority for intact natural ecosystems. Because it's one of the biggest public policy gaps I've ever seen in my life, and it's very, very serious. And that's the take-home message that I want you to have today. I believe in all of these things, but I know there's a gap in the first one. The other message, before I get to helping your brains, the other message is that science and everyday life cannot and should not be separated. As a scientist, I'm telling you that you can understand science. We really need a combination of science, compassion, and common sense. So science without compassion is something that could get us into a lot of trouble. Scientists need to be ethical, they need to be able to communicate with the public, and we all need to have common sense in terms of solving our problems. So, with that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the exciting field of forests and brain health and nature and brain health, because it's a rapidly advancing field, but science is slow. That's the fact. To do science right, it takes a long time to have control groups, to test alternative hypotheses, to make sure you have valid protocols and valid statistical analysis. And people are complicated. So you have a variable system, you need to, it takes time, which is why we also need common sense and first do no harm. I love the motto of the National Health Service forests, growing forests for health. And a take-home message that I want to give you tonight is this benefits everyone. It benefits people of all ages, and it benefits healthy people as well as people who may have a neurological disorder, particularly recovering from stroke, cognitive impairment, post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's many things that haven't been tested. When I was doing the Bullard Fellowship at Harvard, my goal was to do a meta-analysis on forests and brain health to try and pull together the quantified research so that we could make more claims, so that we could perhaps have doctors prescribing this, so that we could make sure that we could make a case for everyone having a forest or a natural area that they could count on to be there for them. And I know that's a major comfort for people, for knowing that there'll be some place that will be there for them when they need it. And in this meta-analysis, some of the things that I found were very strong evidence for reducing anxiety, for reducing stress hormones, and for reducing blood pressure. Now, there's a whole zoo of research out there, but a lot of it's in teenage girls, or it's in just on working memory in one population. So a lot of it is kind of a smattering of research among different populations, testing different measures. And I'd like to just mention that this this book, The Nature Fix, done by Florence Williams, has a lot of studies cited in it, and it's a really great book. It's actually a few years old, but it's still one of my favorites, so I'd recommend this book. And related to the point that people want to have a place that they can count on, I really want to commend the land trusts in this area. We joined the Simsbury Land Trust within a month of moving to Simsbury, and these places that help to protect land for people and for all our relations, for all species, are so critical. Related to forest bathing, there's some new research that just came out that I thought I'd share with you about COVID-19. So if you've been following the COVID-19 story, two things that predict a bad outcome from COVID-19 include poor metabolic health and air pollution. So one thing that these natural areas do, of course, is clean the air. And interestingly, in Italy, what they found was that the lower incidence of COVID-19 deaths, they felt that it was explained by the natural environment, by forest bathing, the Mediterranean environment, and specifically antiviral plant volatile organic compounds. A lot of these compounds are terpenes, which are present in pine trees, in mint, in rosemary. So when you smell that kind of eucalyptus, so you smell that smell, that's something that's actually, could be therapeutic and could be helpful with preventing COVID-19, as well as the decreased air pollution. So when we're talking about trying to improve brain health, there's of course things you could do to help brain health, but the old adage, first rule of holes, stop digging. Stop, the toxic things that are impacting your brain, and air pollution is definitely something that is one of the major causes of premature death worldwide. For those of you who are wondering, I'm not going to talk about this tonight, but yes, gardening is very beneficial. There are specific microbes in the soil they think have antidepressant qualities, so gardening is beneficial. There's not as much work on gardening in all of these different realms, and I think gardening may have a slight different benefits, and I'll talk a little bit more about landscape types in a minute. So I tried doing some searching on things that I thought would be indications of very short-term, but particularly very long-term changes in brain function. So long-term changes in brain function might be changes in cognition, changes in brain structure, changes in gene expression, changes in long-term chronic mental disorders that were improved. So I've been continuing to do kind of a search to see what research is coming out, and I've actually proposed some myself to try and look at this more specifically. And what I found in the peer-reviewed biomedical research is that there is just an exploding amount of research. A lot of it's population studies and epidemiology, some of it's short-term benefits like changes in blood pressure, but there's also evidence for long-term changes, and that would be long-term changes in structure, function, or behavior are the kind of things that can prevent or even reverse disease. So that's really the holy grail in neurological disorders, is how can you prevent or reverse disease? We don't have good treatments for many neurological disorders. And if you look at the economics of mental illness, preventing mental illness has enormous economic benefits. So a little more good news, you don't have to be, doing obstacle courses or, running in the mud or anything like that to experience benefits of nature. Walking is a great form of exercise, and even moving, as I'll show in a moment, even moving through a natural environment is very beneficial. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you is that it improves creativity. So creativity is something you don't see measured that often, but there are actually scales to look at creativity, and being in a natural environment improves it. And what they found is you don't even have to be walking in a natural environment. You can be moved in a chair through a natural environment. And I wanted to bring this up to encourage people who may have poor mobility. It's still beneficial, and encourage land trusts in towns. We have a phenomenal greenway in Simsbury to still be able to get outside and experience some benefits. So what they found in this study is that walking was better than sitting indoors, but sitting outdoors was much better than sitting indoors, and equivalent, not statistically different than walking indoors. So walking outdoors was the best. And some of the creative thinking that was measured was novel ideas, divergent thinking, an increased number of high quality ideas. So it's not just random ideas, it's ideas that were rated as having real merit. Another common goal of psychology or neuroscience is preventing depression. So depression is very common. It can sometimes be difficult to treat. It sometimes will come and go. Anxiety can often progress to depression and then clinical depression. And depression is a very serious and increasing issue, particularly in young people who are feeling very uncomfortable and stressed out about what's going on. And in this annual review of public health, what they tried to look at were what are some of the mechanisms in the brain associated with depression. So neurotransmitters, changes in gene expression. What are some of the kind of proximal causes? Air pollution, pesticides, noise. What are some of the other factors in your life? Your neighborhood, your economy, natural environments. And what are some of the bigger issues? Urban environments, the political system, climate change, etc. So they basically did a major search of all the literature to try and understand whether there was strong evidence for a mechanistic association, weak evidence, etc. And I just want to highlight a couple of things. So in red, I circled the things that are known to be associated with depression. As I mentioned, air pollution, which is number one on the list, is strongly associated with depression. And another factor, urban living, is actually strongly associated with depression. Natural environments are associated with less depression. Related to urbanization, it's well established that living in an urban environment increases rates of mental illness. So you have higher rates of mental illness in urban areas than non-urban areas, although it increased actually more in rural areas during the pandemic. These mental illnesses, anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia, are often associated with rumination. So rumination is negative self-talk, kind of the perseverative thoughts that intrude on other thoughts and can become very debilitating for people. And what I like about this study done at the University of Washington is they did both self-report on rumination and then they did brain imaging on rumination. And they had people spend 90 minutes in an urban environment, walking in an urban environment, or 90 minutes in a natural environment. And after spending 90 minutes in the natural environment, self-reported rumination in the green bar decreased significantly, and it didn't change after 90 minutes in the urban environment. But what I really found impressive about this study is that the activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain area associated with rumination, decreased exactly as the self-report would have predicted. So there was a decrease in blood flow in that rumination-associated prefrontal cortex area. With my students, I've started looking at a couple of measures as we go through different kind of environments. We had planned some field trips that were all canceled, and I said, let's try and look at what we have right in our neighborhood, right around Trinity. And making that our focus has really generated a lot of exciting ideas about how we can make our campus a model of urban ecology, maybe even an arboretum, and how we can partner with other green spaces near us in the center of Hartford. And this graph shows you what we did when we looked at heart rate variability, going around in Hartford, in an urban area, and then we walked into a forest. And what this graph shows is when we entered the forest area, which was around here, there was a big increase in coherence of the heart rate variability that decreased again when we left the forest. And changes in heart rate variability are considered to be associated with stress resilience, perhaps less inflammation, and it's generally considered a positive indicator of health. And heart rate variability is the tiny, tiny difference in timing between your heartbeats. So it's almost like a drum machine versus a real drummer. So your heart rate might be 70 beats per minute, but there's not an exact number of milliseconds between each beat. So this is something that we're pursuing. In terms of special populations that might benefit from nature, there's increasing work in veterans, particularly with veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be very difficult to treat, and also work with at-risk teens. And this is work on the East Coast, work on the West Coast. And one of the things that I think is most important about natural environments and the benefits of natural environments, so I'll just go back to the point I made in the beginning about the mystery and the math. So there's some things that we can quantify, and there's some things perhaps we can't. And awe is the feeling that you have in the presence of something larger than yourself. And there are a number of different experiences that can promote awe. So looking at beautiful artwork or beautiful music. But a natural environment is something that is hopefully accessible to everyone and is one of the most powerful ways to promote awe. And awe is associated with fairness, compassion, empathy, decreased ego, willing to be cooperative, a lot of powerful, positive aspects that we need in our communities. When Walter Reed Hospital moved to Bethesda, they established a 2-acre site called the Green Road. And the point of the Green Road was to provide injured service members and their families a place to experience nature and experience just that mystery and relaxing, multisensory experience, natural healing environment. And what they started doing as part of this Green Road project was look at biomarkers of stress, look at natural language analysis, what was the self-report, what did the injured service members say they were feeling, and what were changes in gene expression. So changes in gene expression are the kinds of things that can promote structural changes, functional changes, cognitive changes. So Dr. Frederick Foote, who was retired from the Navy, he's a neurologist, he said, you just provide the nature and the mind takes care of the rest. In terms of structural changes in the brain, one of my favorite papers was done in Berlin. And the reason why I like this paper is because it looked at different landscape types and looked at changes in a particular brain area associated with kind of emotional processing called the amygdala. And what this study found is that in changes in structure, just to get back to this point, changes in structure in an adult brain are very powerful and very strong indications that there's an opportunity for disease prevention, disease modification, or disease reversal. And what they found is a positive relationship between living within a kilometer of a forest and amygdala integrity, so the structural integrity of the amygdala, based on imaging work. And this was in Berlin. And they divided the landscape into forests, green urban space like parks, urban areas, water, etc. And they found this was specific to forests. A recent paper just came out from the UK that's looking at adolescence. And they looked at adolescent well-being, impulse control, emotional health, and cognitive function. And they found that it was improved much more by spending time in woodlands than spending time in parks. So I think it's something to consider with public policy is we think people need more parks. It may be that maybe parts of our parks should be little woods. I loved a tiny little woods when I was growing up. Even a tiny woods feels like a little oasis to young people. And we might want to think about whether we need vast mowed park spaces and whether some of those spaces could be more natural and provide that kind of oasis and those benefits for young people. So back to kind of evidence-based medicine, which is really, something I strongly subscribe to. Evidence-based medicine is an approach which takes into account patient values and preferences. What do people want? What's the best evidence? Is there some science to support a treatment? And what's the clinical expertise? And if we think about, little forested areas or big forested areas or refuges, natural refuges for people, there's no evidence that they do any harm to our health. They definitely align with public values and the things we need to deal with our global crises, and they are a low-cost option with a high potential for quality and for efficacy. And there are doctors in Scotland and Illinois that I've heard of that are, and also in the UK, that are prescribing nature for their patients. One of the final things I wanted to highlight related to kind of sacred places and mental illness is Gould Farm. And this is a farm in Massachusetts, Monterey, Massachusetts. It's a residential therapeutic facility for people with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. It's a working farm. They have their agricultural land, they have their woodlot, and then they have some natural spaces. And it's an incredibly healing environment, and the access to nature and spending time in nature is one of the bedrock values that Gould Farm brings to people that are there living on the farm for 6 months to 2 years typically. And these are people who have not responded to traditional approaches to mental illness. They've often been through all the drugs, the hospital, etc. It's truly an amazing place. And I have the web address for Gould Farm is on one of the literature pages that I brought tonight. I would encourage you to check it out. And for Gould Farm, this community value of these sacred spaces are that people want quiet, they want solace, they maybe want to look at nature over time. They want to be a scientist and explore that and watch that change. It gives them a very strong connection to place. Once you've been at Gould Farm, you're always welcome there. So it feels like a home to people. And it's also something that can last across generations. In a study in Ireland, they brought people who had what they called mental ill health out to different natural places once a week for 13 weeks. And what they found is that after 13 weeks of going out in small groups, just to a natural area, people improved on multiple measures of depression the same amount as they would have improved if they had had an individual appointment with a counselor at least once or twice a week during that time. And when people were asked, what do you think it was? Why do you think this benefited you? They said the quiet, the beauty, and just a kind of a small group, that it wasn't crowded. I could just relax. It was just our small group. So these very, we don't have math to quantify beauty, but it's something that's very impactful. I would be remiss without recognizing our beautiful little Belden forest right behind the library, which is the first forest in Connecticut to be entered into the Old Growth Forest Network. And I love the mission of the Old Growth Forest Network because its intention is to make sure that there's at least one forest in every county that provides this kind of sacred space that people can count on. And I'm so pleased that this forest is in the network. And now I believe there are 3 in Connecticut. I was just at a dedication at a forest in Lyme a few weeks ago. It's called the Johnston Preserve. Phenomenal place in Lyme. And so more and more forests are added, but these are just tiny, tiny places. We need more places that people can count on and make those part of our strategic network that we need for other things as well. Joan Maloof, Dr. Joan Maloof, who's the executive director and the founder of the Old Growth Forest Network, wrote a really nice piece called Vitamin F, Forests Are Critical for Human and Planetary Health. I would encourage you to look it up. It's a very concise, well-written, and well-referenced piece. So another point about COVID and nature is in a study that was done in 2020 during the pandemic. Using standard scales, they found that feeling strongly nature deprived is worse than losing wages. And I won't go over this whole table, but it was the only thing that was worse than being strongly nature deprived was losing your job entirely. And this work is done by Linda Tomaso. She's at the Harvard School of Public Health, and she's continuing to do a lot of work on nature and health. So being nature deprived is worse than losing wages. You may say, how much time? A study was done saying that at least 120 minutes a week is associated with good health and well-being. This was a big study of 20,000 participants, but you don't have to do it all at one time. It can be in little bits over time, and that's just something to keep in mind. So, in terms of, forests and brain health, some of the restorative opportunities I think we have are to help our brains and leverage the co-benefits of clean air, clean water, climate change mitigation. It's an opportunity for us to protect our natural heritage and the natural state of most of New England. Little forests are probably a natural landscape that is or should be available to the majority of the population. A relatively small area can provide recreation, quiet, and a sense of awe. And there's so much that we're still discovering in terms of epidemiology, mechanisms, medicines, etc. In terms of evidence-based solutions for the planet, it's really important to prevent harm to people and the planet. And I've realized that the two things I really think they need, and of course maybe I'm biased because it's two things that I work on, but for our best future, we need a good brain and we need the natural environment. Those two are not optional. And it's really important to collect sufficient baselines and get a lot more research on what we're doing to make sure that we're doing no harm. That means we need control groups, and you always need healthy controls and detailed research protocols. In terms of our natural systems, we need to increase interdisciplinary approaches, interdisciplinary education, prevention, and outreach. Our major crises right now are in climate and biodiversity. And those are the scientists that we need to be at the table, bringing the latest data to bear and working together. And the first ever IPCC, IPBES, so the climate people and the biodiversity people, the first ever workshop just happened this year. They haven't been talking to each other before now. That's crazy. And their number one recommendation, and unfortunately no one from the United States was involved in this, their number one recommendation was protect nature. Just like in medicine, there's an incredibly important role for watchful waiting and active surveillance. So monitoring is a very important part of science, and I'm very pleased that we have basically delineated about 5% of the land in Simsbury as natural areas that don't have any problems, that we are applying an approach called natural area stewardship. It means we're going to keep track of them, see what's going on, see if there's any problems, deal with those problems if they come up. But there's no chronic maintenance, there's no need for chronic maintenance in this 5% that we picked very carefully because it's the Belden Forest, it's super old and special, or it's a natural corridor, it's a trap rock ridge, or it's a core forest. And the main message about protecting nature is that we need to protect what we can, restore what we can if we know that we can help it, and connect these places. And that's how we're going to establish what's now called a global safety net. So the global safety net is identified areas of high carbon and high biodiversity that need to be protected. Connecticut is in the global safety net. New England is in the global safety net. In fact, it's considered a Tier 1 climate mitigation area. Why is Connecticut so important? We have the largest state-level land trust conference in the country. I was surprised to find that out. I think, oh, Connecticut, we're tiny, but that's important. We have an incredible amount of natural beauty and a very diverse landscape, from the beach to kind of wild areas, to, you know, the Connecticut River Valley, which is a very special area. There's strong public support for nature, for science, and for local systems. We need to take advantage of that. We also have Bushnell Park, which was the first public park that was approved by a referendum. And in Hartford, we also have 2 other Olmsted campuses, the Institute of Living, Trinity College, and we have many other Olmsted properties in Connecticut. But these are kind of centrally located showcase pieces that we can start to talk about these values and the benefits of all of these things in conjunction with Olmsted's 200th birthday in 2022, and I'm delighted that Trinity is having their bicentennial in 2023. Some quotes from Olmsted. He really was committed to beauty and mystery and the kind of benefits of just being there. And some of his quotes: if we analyze the operations of scenes of beauty upon the mind and consider the intimate relation of the mind upon the nervous system, the enjoyment of scenery employs the mind without fatigue and yet exercises it. And the influence of the mind over the body gives the effect of refreshing rest and reinvigoration to the whole system. I'll just share a little perspective from my students. We have some incredible trees on Trinity's campus, and when we, you know, during the pandemic, we couldn't go on field trips, and we decided to just look around us at what we have, you know, right at our doorstep. And this is a slide from these photos. Images are from one of my students' final presentation. And I wrote down this quote: "Why are we celebrating so many things at the college and ignoring these incredible trees?" And my students are now very, very interested and very excited about the possibility of having an arboretum and using our campus as a role model of urban ecology to talk about all of these values. My final point is that I've been involved in a lot of different things, or I am involved in a lot of different things, and people say, "Oh, you do so many things." They're all the same thing. This is what I'm working on all day, every day, is how do we improve brain health, and now how do we address this public policy gap that there's no funding and no programs to really protect intact natural systems like our headwaters, our old growth forests, our riparian corridors. They're very poorly protected. And we need to change that, because something that's not protected, as people who are part of land trusts understand, is just a matter of time. So all of these things are related to health in our community. I handle a community garden at Trinity. I started the Safe Routes to School program in Simsbury, which helps kids walk and bike to school, and I'm delighted that one of the routes is through the woods to Tooten Hills School, and we're going to try improving that to be an ecology trail so the kids can be off the road the whole way to school. It's magical. Many of you remember the Keep the Woods effort to protect the Ethel Walker Woods, which is on top of our aquifer and is a core forest and is now part of the Eastern Wildway. I'm a proud member of the Grange. I would love for you to come and see the Grange. It's a beautiful historic building. We're having a band on Sunday from 3 to 5, and we have a civil rights exhibit in the basement. So please come. We also have some historical photos upstairs. I already mentioned the Old Growth Forest Network. I'd like to thank Harvard for awarding me the Charles Bullard Fellowship in Forest Research, and thank the incredible funding that I've had from the National Institutes of Health on a variety of nuts and bolts issues about the brain, and more recently on brain metabolism. And also thank Trinity College for just their incredible support to my intellectual life and the incredible students and colleagues I have there, including Joe Bronzino, the former Vernon D. Russa Professor of Applied Science. And I really want to just thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any kinds of questions, and thank you so much for coming. Joe.
one of the things that you point out is that evidence-based results lead to dramatic input regarding changes that are beneficial to humankind. We need to encourage those evidence-based studies to go on. The one thing you have in Simsbury is Stratton Forest, which can be used as a test space for a variety of different things. And over the years, you've had evidence that protein malnutrition affects body and brain function. The maturation of the kindling responsible to infant rats also affects their functionality. And there's a new book out called Codebreaker, which is about DNA editing, which is to get the DNA of different cells to change their function by doing procedures which would affect the viruses that are being created naturally.
Yeah, so thank you for that comment. Yeah, so one of the things that I've been working on is kind of related to DNA editing, but is epigenetic changes in the brain. So what are changes that, change what's inherited without changing the gene structure itself? So it's a whole world that we don't know much about. We've just discovered these kind of non-transcribed areas of DNA. There's so much we don't know. I agree with you. I'm very committed to additional basic research. Other questions? Yeah.
A comment. It's a very personal comment, but my brother was a patient at IOL this summer, and I've also been hospitalized for depression. And I kept saying to his therapist, "Can't you let Tim go out and walk? Can't someone take him this beautiful campus, all these magnificent trees?" And the response is, "We would love to do that, but we don't have staff." And then I would say, "Well, could he go out on the patio? They have a patio with he was in a geriatric unit." Well, if we had the staff, some of the patients that wanted to could go, but I kept pushing them because I saying part of recovery is being in nature, being within trees, and it never happened. He was there 6 weeks.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, I'm hoping that this kind of work will start to shift the tide on that. And the Institute of Living is actually the first hospital of any kind in Connecticut. It's an amazing property that has an arboretum, and Olmsted was very committed, I'm not sure if they're all still native, but committed to just putting native trees in that arboretum, and he placed the trees so that when you were out there you wouldn't see the building, so you could feel like you weren't at an institution, that you were out in nature. And he was also very committed when he designed landscapes to try and connect where you were. Let's say if there was a mountain that you could see, he would try and plant the same trees there that would kind of connect to the mountain, so there wasn't anything out of place. You could fully immerse yourself in the experience, and that's very healing. And I think, this is kind of my back to the future nature and brain health. This is common sense stuff that people realized, and we just kind of lost track. And I know that in my work because I've been working for a while. I did a lot of nuts and bolts research in the brain, but working on a dietary therapy for epilepsy that's been effective for 100 years, but we didn't know how it works. So if we have this bias, if we don't know how something works, then we don't do it. We need to kind of think, well, if there's evidence and there's no harm and somebody wants to do it and there's, good clinical evidence, there's no reason not to try that, particularly if it has other co-benefits that I was talking about before. Thank you for that comment. Yes?
Do I remember correctly that Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford was also designed by Olmsted? And one of the ideas behind it was it would give people a place to walk on Sunday and when they weren't working, and it would be refreshing for them.
Yes, so Cedar Hill Cemetery is an example of a rural cemetery, which there was, it's funny because you think rural and you think, out in the, hinterlands, but rural cemeteries were actually in cities, and they were different from graveyards. So graveyards might be what you might find out in the forest someplace, an old graveyard with all the headstones stacked up. But a rural cemetery is someplace that was intended to be like a park as well as a cemetery, and that rural cemetery movement started in about the 1830s, and right next to Trinity is a rural cemetery called Zion Hill Cemetery, which is a little gem, and a friends group has kind of picked it up and started to improve it. And my dream is that when I was talking about in the beginning about having our campus be a role model of urban ecology, what I'd love to do is kind of tack on that little rural cemetery onto that ethic. They have, actually they have a notable tree there. They have at least 24 tree species, and it's a beautiful little property. And it would be nice to have it reclaim that intention. Yes?
Are the trees on Trinity campus currently labeled?
They're not labeled, so that would be one of the goals for our Arboretum project, is to get some of the trees labeled and, you know, get a web space. But we do have about maybe 7 trees that are the top, 7 or 8 that are the top 10 of their species on Trinity's campus, and the one that I showed you is the #1 English elm in Connecticut, actually. Yes?
Can you explain why built-in forest is so important? I don't know about what old growth means.
Well, built-in forest is so important just because it's now protected to just be a little natural forest. The reasons why I think it's important is because it's already very old. There are trees there that we know are well over 150 years old. And once you get over 100, 125 years old, forests start to exhibit the qualities of an old growth forest in New England. We have very little old growth forest, maybe estimates range from maybe 300 to 1,000 acres in Connecticut of real old primary forests, so never been cut. But we have some older forests that are getting to the stage where they have the kind of duff layer, down woody debris, mix of large trees and smaller trees that, you know, are characteristic of an old growth forest. It doesn't mean everything's old, it just means it hasn't been disturbed for a long time.
So all these wonderful, amazing state parks that we have in Connecticut and that have a lot of forest in them, was that land once farmland and then the trees grew up and so it's not that old?
It's probably a mix among the state parks. It could have been something that people used as their woodlot. It could have been farmland that grew back. A lot of farmland was abandoned in the late 1800s, and so the state, you know, would pick it up and then have that, you know, have that as forest land. Another point I wanted to make about Belden, why I think it's so special, is it's so accessible. To have something like that that's right in the middle of town is very unusual, and it's right next to the library, the Veterans Memorial, the church, you know, right across the street, and it's on the bus line, so you can get to it on public transportation. So I think it's also important to make these places, make it known how to get to these places if you don't have a car. You know, maybe we'll be relying more on public transportation in the future, so. Oh, I have one more question, and maybe that's it. Yeah?
Do you believe that 5% natural land is enough, or what would you like to see as a target proportion?
So there was a target established, I forgot what year, a while ago, called the Aichi target, and that said we should protect 17% of our land and 10% of our water. The scientific consensus has evolved since then, and now ranges from 30% to 50%. So there's an effort called 30 by 30, which is saying we need to protect 30% of our land and water. You know, obviously it would be less in an urban area and more in a rural area. But E.O. Wilson, who's, you know, very, very famous Harvard biologist, he basically says we need to protect 50%. If we want to keep this ship running, we need to protect, you know, 50% and focus on areas with high, particularly on areas with high biodiversity, you know. So if we protect 50% of the planet, it can't be, you know, the desert in Antarctica, right? So it matters what amount it is. So I honestly think 30% is a good goal if we're strategic about it and don't just make it any old land. We have to protect the strategic network like I was talking about. And if you want to know how much is protected in the United States right now, It's 12%, but most of it is in Alaska. So only 6% in the lower 48 is protected, like at the level of a national park. And in southern New England, it's only 1%. That's why I'm saying it's a really, really striking gap in public policy that we don't have strategic protection of the lifelines that we need for the future. Yes?
So is there any feeling as to the balance of whether the brain health of these natural areas is the abundance of flora and fauna or the absence of other people?
Interesting. I think that, I think this may be a very individual thing because some people may be, it might be depend on who the other people are, actually. That's a funny question. From the study in Ireland, they appreciated being in a small group that they felt comfortable with. But they also said they really appreciated the quiet. And quiet, I didn't talk about it, but noise was one of the factors that increases depression. And if you look at girls especially that grow up next to highways, their academic performance seems to suffer. So we're bombarded with chronic noise, chronic light, all that kind of stuff. So I think that it's probably the complex flora and fauna and smells and relaxation. And there's some people that could be there with you that aren't negatively affecting that. But, I used to live in Colorado, and I am from New England. I love New England because a lot of the places near Denver where you might want to go for a hike, they're incredibly crowded. It's like you're part of a parade. And so my reason to go out for a hike is to have that mystery and relaxation and get my mind off of all of these things. And we're so fortunate in New England that we have so many beautiful places to enjoy. I appreciate it more and more every day. Yes?
Haven't there been studies on the human brain craving green, the color green?
Yeah, so biophilia is kind of the field that's talking about the affinity that we have for, even looking at pictures of nature is beneficial. And I'll tell you, she doesn't even know what I do or that I'm interested in this, but my cousin was dying a couple of years ago, and I went to visit her, and we were sitting in her room, and she said to me all of a sudden, she's looking out the window, and she said, "All I can tell you is you have no idea how much that tree right there means to me right now." Like, that was the thing that just brought her tremendous comfort in her last days. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That's wonderful. And I know, it certainly backs up the fact that we noticed at the Simsbury Land Trust, the increased use of our trails during the pandemic. So people know that the place to go is outside to feel good. It's an instinctive thing. And we hope that you will all, if you are not a member of the Land Trust now, consider becoming a member of the Land Trust. Because preservation of these incredible places are important. We're really lucky in Simsbury that we have, I think it's about 30% open space, and we need to preserve that and maybe even increase it. So thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.